Hello, my name is Steve, and thank you for joining. Today we are continuing in our series, The Hope of Easter, as we follow Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane. It's in the garden where Jesus prayed the famous words, "Not my will, Father, but yours be done." Let's get started.
Now I know what it is that I've been waiting for. I've been waiting for you. And now I know what people have been talking about for years. They've been talking about you.
Just to the east of Jerusalem, there was an olive grove, and it was called the Mount of Olives. It was a ridge that separated Jerusalem from the Judean wilderness on the other side. And located kind of towards the foot of this ridge was the Garden of Gethsemane, and still is to this day. And this name, Garden of Gethsemane, this name means oil press. And it's a place that Jesus often visited. And if you were to be in the Garden of Gethsemane and you looked back over the Kidron Valley, you would be looking back towards Jerusalem, and it would have provided you just a wide panoramic view of the temple and the old city of Jerusalem. Earlier, it's here where Jesus entered Jerusalem, as we read in Luke's Gospel and the other accounts, where Jesus looked over the city and he wept for the city. Luke chapter 19. And after Jesus' resurrection, we'll talk about this a little bit next week, Jesus returns here to this place with his disciples in Acts chapter 1 and verse 12, as he instructs them before he is taken up to heaven. So the Mount of Olives, the Garden of Gethsemane, where we are this morning in our lesson and our thoughts, they hold a very significant place in the Scriptures. It's also where a close friend is going to betray Jesus with a kiss. As the Passover Plot continues to unfold, we're going to pick up our series in the Garden of Gethsemane, where under the cover of night, Jesus is betrayed, he's handed over, arrested, beaten, placed on trial, and nailed to a Roman cross. It would have been late at night after the conclusion of the Passover meal when Jesus got up from the table and went out to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane. As I mentioned, this was a place that his disciples knew well as they followed Jesus out. And arriving at the garden, Jesus tells his disciples, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." Jesus is in the final hours with the cross before him. And what do we find happening in this scene is that Jesus is tested in a garden. Now, I got to tell you as I was studying for this lesson, and Brenda will tell you, I was just thinking there's got to be something here that I'm missing. And I kept reading over and over this text. And then finally, it hit me. And you who know me, you would have known this should have been obvious, right? If I'm thinking about Jesus being tested in the garden, any other tests in the garden that we can think of? You wouldn't believe it took me on over a week to just think about that, right? Genesis chapter 3, third pages of our Bible. The pages where God's story of redemption begins as humans created in His image are tempted in a garden. And they fell. We know the story, right? We're not going to go through the whole story. You know the story by now. But just a little bit of background. There were the two trees that were placed in the Garden of Eden, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 9. And there's the test. Will the people, will the humans, Adam and Eve, will they follow the wisdom and instruction of God, or will they choose for themselves what is wise and what they will do? And they're tested, they're tempted by a snake, and Adam and Eve failed the test. They choose what looks wise to them. They choose what looks like wisdom in their eyes. In Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6, when the woman saw that the fruit of the tree was good for food and pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, she took some of it and ate. She also gave some to her husband, and he ate with her, and he ate it. The first humans, Adam and Eve, fail the test in the garden. And what we begin to read is God's plan of restoring His creation from this point forward. And it's been a series. If you read through the entirety of the Hebrew Scriptures, you'll see a series of ups and downs, of side turns and side tracks. Sometimes we do very good as a people, other times we do very bad as a people. And through all this story, now, as we begin here in a garden, in Genesis chapter 3, we find Jesus in a garden, being tested. It's not a spoiler alert, but what's going to happen? Will Jesus pass this test, or will He fail like others have failed? That's kind of the question that the authors are setting up for us. Will Jesus pass the test? One of the things that we see in the Garden of Gethsemane is that here the humanity of Jesus is vividly on display. We also come in contact with the deity of Christ, but here I think His humanity is shown as very real. And what I mean by that is there's a lot of times as we read through the Scriptures, as we study Jesus, as we learn to shape our lives after Him, we forget sometimes that He was a person, that He was a man, that He in many ways was much like you and I. We forget about the humanity of Christ. But one of the things that I kind of like here in this garden story with Jesus is that we really see the humanity of Christ. We see a very real stress in His life. We see very deep sorrow. We see anguish in Jesus. We see the humanity of Jesus in the garden. He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, that is the disciples, and He knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." And an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. Notice what the text says, "And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly. And his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." See, Jesus was distressed. He was in anguish. He was sweating profusely here. So much so that his sweat would appear like if you had a gash on your forehead and your blood is just dropping to the ground. This is how much Jesus is sweating. This is how profusely He's sweating because of His stress and the anguish that He's under at this particular time. You see, there was a snake present in the garden in Genesis chapter 3. And there's a snake present here with Jesus. And what He's trying to do is convince Jesus to do anything necessary to forego the Father's will. He's trying to test Jesus, to take His own shortcut. Remember before, when the serpent, the snake, the devil tempted Jesus earlier in Luke's gospel? after Jesus has fasted again in the wilderness, and he was tested by the serpent. Consequently, I wasn't going to mention this, but if you want to really impress your friends at a party one night, you notice here that an angel of the Lord strengthened Jesus here in Luke's Gospel in the Garden of Gethsemane. There's one other time you're told about that in Luke's Gospel. Remember? Back in the wilderness, right? When he was tempted by the serpent there, the devil, the angels ministered to Jesus as well. Just a fun little thing to study out and really impress all your friends if you want to sometime. May not win you too many friends, I don't know. But what we find is that Jesus prays more earnestly. He's being tested to take a shortcut again, like the enemy had tested him before. Just throw yourself down. If you bow down to me, I'll give you all the kingdoms of the earth. Anything to distract Jesus from fulfilling the Father's will and the Father's purposes. And Jesus, as he comes back from praying, he finds his disciples sleeping. When he arose from prayer, he went back to his disciples and found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? Jesus asked them. Get up and pray that you will not fall into temptation. Notice what the text says. I think we miss this sometimes. At least I've missed this before. They were sleeping because they were exhausted from sorrow. The disciples. Have you ever been in such anguish? Have you ever been in such sorrow when there are just no more tears left to cry and you're just wore out? You're exhausted. You're in anguish. That's where the disciples are. More than likely, I can't prove this, but I think for the first time they're starting to be confronted with the fact that Jesus is going to die. As I mentioned, this was not in their narrative. It was not in their story that the Messiah was going to be put to death by the Romans or on a Roman cross. And I think they're confronted with this kind of for the first time, and they're starting to realize what's going on here. And they're in great sorrow. There are no more tears left to cry. But Jesus recognizes the danger that they're in. Why are you sleeping? Wake up and pray so that you'll not be led into temptation, because great sorrow can do what? It can lead us to depression. It can lead us to anxiety. It can lead us to a lot of things. And it can lead us away from Jesus. I think that's what he's instructing his disciples to do, is to pray. Pray for God's strength. Pray for God's wisdom so that you're not led away through temptation. And I think for us, there's a lesson to learn right there. I think for us, when we are overwhelmed, when we are full of sorrow and anguish, it's not the time to sleep. It's not the time to sleep. But when sorrow fills our hearts, when there are no more tears left to cry, it's not the time to sleep. It's the time to pour our hearts out to God. It's not time to close the Father off, but to draw near to Him. And how often is our reaction in those times to cut God off? Why? But Jesus is reminding the disciples, He's telling them, pray, pray. Why? Don't cut yourself off from God. Don't be drawn away into temptation. Rely on His strength. Rely on His wisdom. And I think that's a word for us today. When we find ourselves in similar situations, instead of pushing God away, we need to pull Him closer. We need to get on our knees. We need to cry out to our Father in prayer, just expressing our hearts to Him. Draw near to God. In this example of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, what we find is His surrender to the Father's wisdom. Father, if you are willing, let this cup pass from me. Yet, not my will, but yours be done. From the Gospel of Matthew, and Matthew's account of this very scene, Matthew, we learn that Jesus prayed this prayer 3 times. That He echoed this prayer. Father, if you're willing, let this cup pass from me. But not my will, but yours be done. On the night of Jesus' testing, unlike the first Adam, Jesus surrenders to the Father's will. He surrenders to the Father's wisdom. The cup does not pass from Jesus. He submits Himself to the wisdom of God, the wisdom of the Father. See, the cross is just in the foreground. And the Son of Man, Jesus the Son, must go through death as He bears sin. And He goes through death so that you and I and others can find life. And we find life in Him. In the garden, it would have been dark. As Jesus has knelt down and He's prayed great anguish and stress and sorrow. And then suddenly, as you look up back over the Kidron Valley towards Jerusalem and the Temple Mount, the darkness is pierced by the light of torches. As the mob starts to come down into the valley to go back up to the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus would have seen in the distance the torchlight of the mobs who were coming for Him as they were led by Judas Iscariot, one of His close friends and disciples. Those who are coming to fulfill the Passover plot to take Jesus. You see, Jesus would have had plenty of time here to run. Yet one other chance to deny the Father's purpose. The Bible doesn't say this, but I can just imagine Jesus waiting. Waiting for the Father's time, as He's been doing throughout the entirety of Luke's narrative and the other gospel authors. The multitude led by Judas arrives in the garden. And Judas steps forward because he's told him, the one that I kiss on the cheek, that's Jesus, that's the one. And Judas steps forward and betrays his friend Jesus, his rabbi, with a kiss. Arrested, his other disciple, Peter, denies that he knows Him, denies that he was ever with Him. And Jesus is mocked, He's beaten, and He's sent to trial. If you look down through Luke chapter 22, 23, you'll see that Jesus is bounced from Herod to Pilate to back to Pilate. Herod, Pilate, back to Pilate. Bounced back and forth. They can't find anything to accuse Him of. You see, Luke began by telling us that there was an accuser that was coming. But he's shown us, we haven't really paid attention to this thread running through the theme, but he's shown us over and over again how even though Jesus was accused of things that were false, Jesus was innocent. And here again, Pilate says the same thing. I find no reason this man should be put to death. But the mob shouts all the more, crucify him, crucify him. He's placed on a Roman cross. And he's raised up between two criminals. The man, as the Apostle Paul records in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, who knew no sin, became sin for us. And Jesus cries out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land till 3 p.m. The sun had stopped shining. The curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus calls out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. When he had said this, he breathed his last. The centurion, seeing what had happened, praised God and said, surely this was a righteous man. And when all the people who had gathered to witness this sight saw what took place, they beat their breasts, they went away. But all of those who knew him, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching all these things. The body of Jesus that evening was taken down from the cross, wrapped in linen garments, and laid in a tomb that was carved out of stone. It would seem that the Passover plot has been complete. Jesus has been crucified. He's placed in a tomb. But what we're going to find next week is the Passover plot takes a twist as we continue to follow Jesus on this journey through Jerusalem. Before this morning, I would like for us to consider a few things for ourselves today as we think about these events and the things that have transpired. A few things I think that we could take away for ourselves. Exhausted from sorrow and deep pain, Jesus shows us the example of prayer. Don't close ourselves off to God in times of trial. Don't close yourself off to God in times of testing. I know sometimes when it feels like sin's got the best of us, that's when we're most ashamed to come before God. It's when we're most ashamed to come before Him and admit we've done something wrong. But don't close yourself off to God. Even in times of trial and testing, I would say more so in times of trial and testing, draw near to God. Rely on Him in prayer. Rely on His strength, His wisdom. Seek God in times of difficulty. We're going to all experience times of testing. There's no doubt. No person, no Christian, no human that's going to walk on this earth and not go through difficult times, not go through trials. We will all experience times of testing. But Christian, here's what we need to do. You and I, we need to seek the wisdom of God for our lives. And when we go through times of testing, it's not what we think is wise that we should immediately do, but we need to seek God's wisdom in difficult times. God's wisdom in times of trials. Follow the Spirit of God as He directs you to godly wisdom. The last thing is this: Jesus willingly went to the cross. And He did so for us. He did so for sin, As the Apostle Paul says, he became sin for us. He followed the Father's wisdom to the end. He's the only one that passed the test. So we look back in the Scriptures, we look back in the Hebrew Scriptures, we see time and time again how people failed to follow God's wisdom. Jesus followed the wisdom of God to the cross. And he did so for us.